Sapiens by Yuval Harari. Part 4, The Scientific Revolution. Chapter 14, The Discovery of Ignorance. Verse say, a Spanish peasant who have fallen asleep in AD 1000 and woken up 500 years later to the din of Columbus, sailors boarding the Nina, Pinta and Santa Maria. The world would have seemed to him quite familiar. Despite many changes in technology, manners, and political boundaries, this medieval Rip Van Winkle would have felt at home. But had one of the Columbus's sailors fallen into a similar slumber and woken up to the ringtone of the 21st century iPhone, he would have found himself in a world strange beyond comprehension. In this heaven? Is this heaven? He might well have asked himself, or perhaps hell. In the last 500 years, we have witnessed a phenomenal and unprecedented growth in human power. In the year 1500, there were about 500 million Homo sapiens in the entire world. Today, there are 7 billion. The total value of goods and services produced by humankind in the year 1500 is estimated at $250 billion in today's dollars. Nowadays, the value of a year of human production is close to $60 trillion. In 1500, humanity consumed about 13 trillion calories of energy per day. Today, we consume 1500 trillion calories a day. Suppose a single modern battleship got transported back to Columbus's time. In a matter of seconds, it could make driftwood out of the Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria, and then sink the navies of every great world power of the time without sustaining a scratch. 5 modern fighters could have taken on board all the cargo borne by the whole world's merchant fleets. A modern computer could have easily stored every word and number in all the codex books and scrolls in every single medieval library with the room to spare. Any large bank today holds more money than the world's pre-modern kingdoms put together. In 1500, few cities had more than 100,000 inhabitants. Most buildings were constructed of mud, wood and straw. A 3-story building was a skyscraper. The streets were rutted dirt tracks, dusty in summer and muddy in winters, plied by pedestrians, horses, goats, chickens and few carts. The most common urban noises were human and animal voices, along with the occasional hammer and saw. At sunset, the city space went black, with only an occasional candle or torch flickering in the gloom. If an inhabitant of such a city could see modern Tokyo, New York, or Mumbai, what would she think? Prior to the 16th century, no human has circumnavigated the earth. This changed in 1522, when Magellan's expedition returned to Spain after a journey of 72,000 kilometers. It took 3 years and cost the lives of almost all the crew members. Magellan included. In 1873, Julius Verne could imagine that Phileas Fogg, a wealthy British adventurer, might just be able to make it around the world in 80 days. Today, anyone with middle-class income can safely and easily circumnavigate the globe in just 48 hours. In 1500, humans were confined to the Earth's surface. They could build towers and climb mountains, but the sky was reserved for the birds, angels, and deities. On 20th July 1969, humans landed on the moon. This was not merely a historical achievement, but an evolutionary and even cosmic fiat. During the previous 4 billion years of evolution, no organisms managed even to leave the Earth's atmosphere, and certainly none left a foot or tentacle print on the moon. For the most of history, humans knew nothing about 99.99% of the organisms on the planet, namely the microorganisms. This was not because they were of no concern to us. Each of us bears millions of one-celled creatures within us, and not just as free riders. They are our best friends and deadliest enemies. Some of them digest our food and clean our guts, while others cause illnesses and epidemics. Yet, it was only in 1674 that human eye first saw microorganisms, when Antony van Leeuwenhoek took a peek through homemade microscope and was startled to see an entire world of tiny creatures milling about in a drop of water. During the subsequent 300 years, humans have made the acquaintance of huge number of microscopic species. We have managed to defeat most of the deadliest contagious diseases they cause and have harnessed microorganisms in the services of medicine and industry. Today, we engineer bacteria to produce medications, manufacture biofuels, and kill parasites. But the single most remarkable and defining moment of the past 500 years came at 5:29:45 on July 16, 1945. At the precise second, American scientists detonated the first atomic bomb at Alamo Gordo, New Mexico. From that point onwards, humankind had the capability not only to change the course of history but to end it. The historical process that led to Alamo Gordo and to the moon is known as the scientific revolution. During this revolution, humankind has obtained enormous new powers by investing resources in scientific research. It is a revolution because until about AD 1500, humans the world overdoubted their ability to obtain new medical, military, and economic powers, while governments and wealthy patrons allocated funds to education and scholarship. The aim was, in general, to preserve existing capabilities rather than acquire new ones. The typical pre-modern ruler gave money to priests, philosophers, and poets in the hope that they would legitimize his rule and maintain the social order. He did not expect them to discover new medications, invent new weapons, or stimulate economic growth. During the last 5 centuries, humans increasingly came to believe that they could increase their capabilities by investing in scientific research. This wasn't just blind faith, it was repeatedly proven empirically. The more proofs there were, the more resources wealthy people and governments were willing to put into science. We would never have been able to walk on the moon, engineer microorganisms, and split the atom without such investments. The US government, for example, has in recent decades allocated billions of dollars to the study of nuclear physics. The knowledge produced by this research has made possible the construction of nuclear power stations, which provides cheap electricity for American industries, which pay taxes to the US government, which uses some of these taxes to finance further research in nuclear physics. Why did modern humans develop a growing belief in their ability to obtain new powers through research? What forged the bond between science, politics, and economics? This chapter looks at the unique nature of modern science in order to provide part of this answer. The next 2 chapters examine the formation of the alliance between science and the European empires and the economics of capitalism. Ignoramus. Humans have sought to understand the universe at least since the cognitive revolution. Our ancestors put a great deal of time and efforts into trying to discover the rules that govern the natural world. But modern science differs from all previous traditions of knowledge in 3 critical systems. Number 1, the willingness to admit ignorance. Number 2, the centrality of observation and mathematics. And number 3, the acquisition of new powers. The scientific revolution has not been a revolution of knowledge. It has been, above all, been a revolution of ignorance. The great discovery that launched the scientific revolution was the discovery that humans do not know the answers to their most important questions. Pre-modern traditions of knowledge, such as the Islam, Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, asserted that everything that is important to know about the world was already known. The great gods of the one almighty God, or the wise people of the past, possessed all-encompassing wisdom, which they revealed to us in scriptures and oral traditions. Ordinary mortals gained knowledge by delving into these ancient texts and traditions and understanding them properly. It was inconceivable that the Bible, the Quran, or the Vedas were missing out on crucial secrets of universe, a secret that might yet be discovered by flesh and blood creatures. Ancient traditions of knowledge admitted only 2 kinds of ignorance. First, an individual might be ignorant of something important. To obtain the necessary knowledge, all he needed to do was to ask somebody wiser. There was no need to discover something that nobody yet knew. For example, if a peasant in some 13th century Yorkshire village wanted to know how the human race originated, he assumed that Christian tradition held the definitive answer. All he had to do was to ask the local priest. Second, the entire tradition might be ignorant of unimportant things. By definition, whatever the great gods or the wise people of the past did not bother to tell was unimportant. For example, if our Yorkshire peasant wanted to know how spiders weave their webs, it was pointless to ask the priest because there was no answer to this question in any of the Christian scriptures. That did not mean, however, that Christianity was deficient. Rather, it meant that understanding how spiders weave their webs was unimportant. After all, God knew perfectly well how the spiders do it. If this was a vital piece of information necessary for human prosperity and salvation, God would have included a comprehensive explanation in the Bible. Christianity did not forbid people to study spiders, but spider scholars, if there were any in medieval Europe, had to accept their peripheral role in society and the irrelevance of their findings to the eternal truths of Christianity. No matter what a scholar might discover about spiders or butterflies or Galapagos finches, that knowledge was little more than trivia, with no bearing on the fundamental truths of society, politics, and economics. In fact, things were never quite that simple. In every age, even the most pious and conservative, there were people who argued that there were important things of which the entire tradition was ignorant. Yet, such people were usually marginalized or persecuted, or else they founded a new tradition and began arguing that they knew everything there is to know. For example, the Prophet Muhammad began his religious career by condemning his fellow Arabs for living in ignorance of the divine truth. Yet, Muhammad himself very quickly began to argue that he knew the full truth, and his followers began calling him the seal of the prophets. Henceforth, there was no need of revelations beyond those given to Muhammad. Modern day science is a unique tradition of knowledge, inasmuch as it openly admits collective ignorance regarding the most important questions. Darwin never argued that he has the seal of the biologists and that he had solved the riddle of life once and for all. After centuries of extensive scientific research, biologists admit that they still don't have any good explanation of how brains produce consciousness. Physicists admit that they don't know what caused the Big Bang and how to reconcile quantum mechanics with the theory of general relativity. In other cases, competing scientific theories are vociferously debated on the basis of constantly emerging new evidence. A prime example is the debates about how best to run the economy. Though individual economists may claim that their method is the best, orthodoxy changes with every financial crisis and stock exchange bubble, and it is generally accepted that the final word of economics is yet to be said. In still other cases, particular theories are supported so consistently by the available evidence that all alternatives have long since fallen by the wayside. Such theories are accepted as true, yet everyone agrees that there were new evidence to emerge that contradicts the theory. It would have to be revised or discarded. Good examples of these are the plate tectonics theory and the theory of evolution. The willingness to admit ignorance has made modern science more dynamic, supple, and inquisitive than any previous tradition of knowledge. This has hugely expanded our capacity to understand how the world works and our ability to invent new technologies. But it presents us with a serious problem that most of our ancestors did not have to cope with: our current assumption that we do not know everything and that even the knowledge we possess is tentative extends to the shared myths that enable millions of strangers to cooperate effectively. If the evidence shows that many of those myths are doubtful, how can we hold society together? How can our communities, countries, and international systems function? All modern attempts to stabilize the socio-political order have had no choice but to rely on either two unscientific methods. Number one, take a scientific theory and, in opposition to common scientific practices, declare that it is a final and absolute truth. This was a method used by Nazis and communists. Second, leave science out of it and live in accordance with a non-scientific absolute truth. This has been the strategies of liberal humanism, which is built on the dogmatic belief in a unique worth and rights of human beings, a doctrine which has embarrassingly little in common with the scientific study of Homo sapiens. But that should not surprise us. Even science itself has to rely on religious and ideological beliefs to justify and finance its research. modern culture has nevertheless been willing to embrace ignorance to a much greater degree than has any previous culture. One of the things that has made it possible for modern social orders to hold together is the spread of an almost religious beliefs in technology and in methods of scientific research, which has replaced to some extent the beliefs in absolute truth. Coming to the scientific dogma. Modern science has no dogma, yet it has a common core of research methods, which are all based on collecting empirical observations. Those we can observe with at least one of our senses and putting them together with the help of mathematical tools. People throughout history collected empirical observations, but the importance of these observations was usually limited. Why waste precious resources obtaining new observations when we already have all the answers we need? But as modern people came to admit that they did not know the answers to some very important questions, they found it necessary to look for completely new knowledge. Consequently, the dominant modern research method takes for granted the insufficiency of the old knowledge. Instead of studying old traditions, emphasis is now placed on new observations and experiments. When present observations collides with past traditions, we give precedence to the observations. Of course, physicists analyzing the spectra of distant galaxies, archaeologists analyzing the finds from the Bronze Age cities, and political scientists studying the emergence of capitalism do not disregard tradition. They start by studying what the wise people of the past have said and written. But from their first year in college, aspiring physicists, archaeologists, and political scientists are taught that it is their mission to go beyond what Einstein, Heinrich, and Max Weber ever knew. Mere observations, however, are not knowledge. In order to understand the universe, we need to connect observations into comprehensive theories. Earlier traditions usually formulated their theories in terms of stories. Modern science uses mathematics. There are very few equations, graphs, and calculations in Bible and Quran, the Vedas, or Confucian classics. When traditional mythologies and scriptures laid down general laws, these were presented in narrative rather than mathematical form. Thus, a fundamental principle of Manichaean religion asserted that the world is a battleground between good and the evil. An evil force created matter, while a good force created spirit. Humans are caught between these two forces and should choose good over evil. Yet, the prophet Mani made no attempt to offer a mathematical formula that could be used to predict human choices by quantifying the respective strength of these two forces. He never calculated that the force acting on a man is equal to the acceleration of his spirit divided by the mass of his body. This is exactly what scientists seek to accomplish. In 1687, Isaac Newton published The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, arguably the most important book in modern history. Newton presented the general theory of movement and change. The greatness of Newton's theory was its ability to explain and predict the movement of all bodies in the universe, from falling apples to shooting stars, using three very simple mathematical laws. Henceforth, anyone who wished to understand and predict the movements of cannonball or the planet simply had to make measurements of the object's mass, direction, and acceleration, and forces acting on it. By inserting these numbers into Newton's equation, the future position of the object could be predicted. It worked like magic. Only around the end of 19th century did scientists come across a few observations that did not fit well with Newton's laws, and these led to the next revolution in physics, the theory of relativity and quantum mechanics. Newton showed that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. Some chapters boil down to a clear-cut equation, but scholars who attempted to reduce biology, economics, and psychology to neat Newtonian equations have discovered that these fields have a level of complexity that makes such an aspiration futile. This need not mean, however, that they gave up on mathematics. A new branch of mathematics was developed over the last 200 years to deal with the more complex aspect of reality, statistics. In 1744, two plebeian clergymen in Scotland, Alexander Webster and Robert Wallace, decided to set up life insurance fund that would provide pensions for the widows and orphans of dead clergymen. They proposed that each of their church's ministers would pay a small portion of his income into the fund, which would invest the money. If the minister died, his widow would receive dividends on the fund's profit. This would allow her to live comfortably for the rest of her life, but to determine how much the ministers had to pay in so that the fund would be enough money to live up to its obligations. Webster and Wallace had to be able to predict how many ministers would die each year, how many widows and orphans they would leave behind, and by how many years the widows would outlive their husbands. Take note of what the two churchmen did not do. They did not pray to God to reveal the answers, nor did they search for the answers in the Holy Scriptures or among the works of ancient theologians, nor did they enter into an abstract philosophical disputation. Being Scots, they were practical types, so they contracted a professor of mathematics from the University of Edinburgh, Colin Maclaurin. The three of them collected data on the ages at which people died and used these to calculate how many ministers were likely to pass away in the given year. Their work was founded on several recent breakthroughs in the fields of statistics and probability. One of these was Jacob, law of large numbers. Bernoulli has codified the principles that while it might be difficult to predict with certainty a single event, such as death of a particular person, it was possible to predict with great accuracy the average outcome of many similar events. That is, while Maclaurin could not use maths to predict whether Webster and Wallace would die next year, he could given even enough data, tell Webster and Wallace how many plebiscitarian ministers in the Scotland would almost certainly die next year. Fortunately, they had ready-made data for that which could be used. Actuary tables published 50 years previously by Edmond Halley proved particularly useful. Halley had analyzed records of 1238 births and 1174 deaths that he obtained from the city of Breslau, Germany. Halley's tables made it possible to see that, for example, the 20-year-old person had 1:100 chance of dying in a given year, but a 50-year-old person has 1:39 chance. Processing these numbers, Webster and Wallace concluded that on average there would be 930 living Scottish plebiscitarians ministers at any given moment, and an average of 27 ministers would die each year, 18 of whom would be survived by widows. 5 of those who died not leave widows would leave orphaned children, and 2 of the one who survived by widows would be outlived by the children from previous marriage who had not yet reached the age of 16. They further computed how much time was likely to go before the widow's death or remarriage. These figures enabled Webster and Wallace to determine how much money the ministers who joined their funds had to pay in order to provide for their loved ones. By contributing a year, a minister could guarantee that his widowed wife would receive at least €10 a year, a hefty sum in those days. If he thought that was not enough, he could choose to pay in more, up to level of €6 a year, which could guarantee his widow the even more handsome sum of €25 a year. According to their calculations, by the year 1765, the fund for a provision for the widows and children of the ministers of the Church of Scotland would have capital totaling around €58,348. The calculations proved amazingly accurate. When that year arrived, the fund's capital stood at €58,347, just €1 less than the prediction. This was even better than the prophecies of Habakkuk, Gemariah, and St. John. Today, Webster and Wallace's fund, known simply as the Scottish Widows, is one of the largest pension and insurance companies in the world, with assets worth €100 billion. It insures not only Scottish widows, but anyone willing to buy its policies. Probability calculations, such as those used by the 2 Scottish ministers, became the foundation not merely of actuarial science, which is central to the pension and insurance business, but also the science of demography. Demography, in its turn, was cornerstone of which Charles Darwin built his theory of evolution. While there is no equation that predicts what kind of organisms will evolve under the specific set of conditions, geneticists use probability calculations to compute the likelihood that a particular mutation will spread in a given population. Similar probabilistic models have become central to the economics, sociology, psychology, political science, and other social and natural sciences. Even physics eventually supplemented Newton's classical equations with the probability clouds of quantum mechanics. We need merely look at the history of education to realize how far this process has taken us. Throughout most of history, mathematics was an esoteric field that even educated people rarely studied seriously. In medieval Europe, logic, grammar, and rhetoric formed the educational core, while the teachings of mathematics seldom went beyond simple arithmetic and geometry. Nobody studied statistics. The undisputed monarch of all sciences was theology. Today, few students study rhetorics. Logic is restricted to philosophy departments and theology to seminaries. But more and more students are motivated or forced to study mathematics. There is an irresistible drift towards exact sciences, defined as exact by the use of mathematical tools. Even fields of study that were traditionally part of the humanities, such as the study of humans and the human psyche, rely increasingly on mathematics and seek to present themselves as exact sciences. Statistics courses are now part of the basic requirements not just in physics and biology, but also in psychology, sociology, economics, and political science. In the course catalogue of the psychology department at my own university, the first required course in the curriculum is Introduction to Statistics and Methodology in Psychological Research. Second year psychology student must take statistical methods in psychological research. Confucius, Buddha, Jesus, and Muhammad would have been bewildered if you had told them that in order to understand the human mind and cure its illnesses, you must first study statistics. Knowledge is power. Most people have a hard time digesting modern science because its mathematical language is difficult for our minds to grasp, and its findings often contradict common sense. Out of the 7 billion people in the world, how many really understand quantum mechanics, cell biology, or macroeconomics? Sciences nevertheless enjoys immense prestige because of the new powers it gives us. Presidents and generals may not understand nuclear physics, but they have good grasp of what nuclear bombs can do. In 1620, Francis Bacon published a scientific manifesto titled The New Instrument. In it, he argued that knowledge is power. The real test of knowledge is not whether it is true, but whether it empowers us. Scientists usually assume that no theory is 100% correct. Consequently, truth is a poor test of knowledge. The real test is utility. A theory that enables us to do new things constitutes knowledge. Over the centuries, science has offered us many new tools. Some are mental tools, such as those used to predict death rates and economic growth. Even more important are technological tools. The connection forged between science and technology is so strong that today people tend to confuse the two. We often think that it is impossible to develop new technologies without scientific research, and that there is little point in research if it does not result in new technologies. In fact, the relationship between science and technology is a very recent phenomenon. Prior to 1500, science and technology were totally separate fields. When Bacon connected the two in the early 17th century, it was a revolutionary idea. During the 17th and the 18th century, this relationship tightened, but the knot was tied only in the 19th century. Even in 1800, most rulers who wanted a strong army and most business magnates who wanted a successful business did not bother to finance research in physics, biology, or economics. I don't mean to claim that there is no exception to this rule. A good historian can find precedent for everything, but an even better historian knows when these precedents are but curiosities that cloud the big picture. Generally speaking, most pre-modern rulers and business people did not finance research about the nature of the universe in order to develop new technologies, and most thinkers did not try to translate their findings into technological gadgets. Rulers financed educational institutions whose mandate was to spread traditional knowledge for the purpose of buttressing the existing order. Here and there, people did develop new technologies, but these were usually created by uneducated craftsmen using trial and error, not by scholars pursuing systematic scientific research. Cart manufacturers built the same carts from the same material year in and year out. They did not set aside a percentage of their annual profits in order to research and develop new card models. Card designs occasionally improved, but it was usually thanks to the ingenuity of some local carpenters who never set foot in a university and did not even know how to read. This was true for the public as well as the private sector, whereas modern states call it their scientists to provide solutions in almost every area of national policy, from energy to health to waste disposal. Ancient kingdoms seldom did so. The contrast between them then and now is most pronounced in weaponry, when ongoing President Dwight Eisenhower warned in 1961 of the growing power of military-industrial complex. He left out a part of the equation. He should have altered his country to the military-industrial scientific complex, because today's wars are scientific productions. The world's military forces initiate, funds, and steer a large part of humanity's scientific research and technological development. When the First World War bogged down into interminable trench warfare, both sides called in the scientists to break the deadlock and save the nation. The men in white answered the call, and out of the laboratories rolled a constant stream of new wonder weapons, combat aircrafts, poison gas, tanks, submarines, and even more efficient machine guns, artillery pieces, rifles, and bombs. Science played an even larger role in the Second World War. By late 1944, Germany was losing the war and defeat was imminent. A year earlier, the German allies, the Italians, had toppled Mussolini and surrendered to its allies, but Germany kept fighting on, even though the British, American, and the Soviet armies were closing in. One reason German soldiers and civilians thought not all was lost was that they believed German scientists were about to turn the tide with so miracle weapons such as the V-2 rocket and jet power aircrafts. While the Germans were working on rockets and jets, the American Manhattan Project successfully developed atomic bombs. By the time the bomb was ready in early August 1945, Germany has already surrendered, but Japan was fighting on. American forces were poised to invade its home island. The Japanese vowed to resist the invasion and fight to the death. And there was every reason to believe that it was no idle threat. American generals told President Harry S. Truman that an invasion of Japan would cost the lives of millions of American soldiers and would extend the war well into 1946. Truman decided to use the new bomb. 2 weeks and 2 atom bombs later, Japan surrendered unconditionally and the war was over. But science is not just about offensive weapons, it plays a major role in our defenses as well. Today, many Americans believe that the solution to terrorism is technological rather than political. Just give millions more to nanotechnology industry, they believe, and the United States could send bionic spy flies into every Afghan cave, Yemenite redoubt, and North African encampment. Once that's done, Osama bin Laden's heirs will not be able to make a cup of coffee without a CIA spy fly passing this vital information back to the headquarters in Langley. Allocate millions more to the brain research, and every airport could be equipped with ultra-sophisticated fMRI scanners that could immediately recognize angry and hateful thoughts in people's brain. Will it really work? Who knows? It is wise to develop bionic flies and thought-reading scanners, not necessarily. Be that as it may. As you read these lines, the US Department of Defense is transferring millions of dollars into nanotechnology and brain laboratories for work on these and other such ideas. This obsession with military technology, from tanks to atom bombs to spy flies, is a surprisingly recent phenomenon. Up until the 19th century, the vast majority of military revolutions were the product of organizational rather than technological changes. When alien civilizations met for the first time, technological gaps sometimes played an important role. But even in such cases, few thought of deliberately creating or enlarging such gaps. Most empires did not rise thanks to technological wizardry, and their rulers did not give much thought to technological improvement. The Arabs did not defeat the Sassanid Empire thanks to superior bows or swords. The Seljuks had no technological advantage over the Byzantines, and the Mongols did not conquer China with the help of some ingenious new weapons. In fact, in all these cases, the vanquished enjoyed superior military and civilian technology. The Roman army is a particularly good example. It was the best army of its day, yet, technologically speaking, Rome had no edge over Carthage, Macedonia, or the Seleucid Empire. Its advantage rested on efficient organization, iron discipline, and huge manpower. The Roman army never set up research and development departments, and its weapons remained more or less the same for centuries on end. If the legions of Scipio, the general who leveled Carthage and defeated the Numantians in the 2nd century BC, had suddenly popped up 500 years later in the age of Constantine the Great, Scipio would have had a fair chance of beating Constantine. Now imagine what would happen to a general from a few centuries back, say Napoleon, if he had his troops against the modern armored brigade. Napoleon was a brilliant tactician, and his men were crack professionals, but their skills would be useless in the face of modern weaponry. As in Rome, so also in ancient China, most generals and philosophers did not think in their duty to develop new weapons. The most important military invention in the history of China was gunpowder. Yet, to the best of our knowledge, gunpowder was invented accidentally by Taoists alchemists searching for the elixir of life. Gunpowder's subsequent career is even more telling. One might have thought that the Taoist alchemists would have made China master of the world. In fact, the Chinese used the new compound mainly for firecrackers. Even as the Song Empire collapsed in the face of Mongol invasion, no emperor set up a medieval Manhattan Project to save the empire by inventing a doomsday weapon. Only in the 15th century, about 600 years after the invention of gunpowder, did cannons become a decisive factor on Afro-Asian battlefields. Why did it take so long for the deadly potential of this substance to be put into military use? Because it appeared at a time when neither kings, scholars, nor merchants thought that new military technology could save them and make them rich. The situation began to change in 15th and 16th centuries, but another 200 years went by before most rulers evinced any interest in financing the research and development of new weapons. Logistics and strategy continued to have far greater impact on the outcomes of war than technology. The Napoleonic military machine that crushed the armies of European powers was armed with more or less the same weaponry that of the Louis XVI had used. Napoleon himself, despite being an artilleryman, had little interest in new weapons, even though scientists and inventors tried to persuade him to fund the development of flying machines, submarines, and rockets. Science, industry, and military technology intertwined only with the advent of capitalist system and the Industrial Revolution. Once this relationship was established, however, it quickly transformed the world. Coming to the ideal of progress. Until the scientific revolution, most human cultures did not believe in progress. They thought the golden age was in the past and that the world was stagnant, if not deteriorating. Strict adherence to wisdom of the ages might perhaps bring back the good old times, and human ingenuity might conceivably improve this or the facet of daily life. However, it was considered impossible for human know how to overcome the world's fundamental problems. If even Muhammad, Jesus, Buddha, and Confucius, who knew everything there is to know, were unable to abolish famine, disease, poverty, and war from the world, how could we expect to do so? Many faiths believed that someday a Messiah would appear and end all wars, famines, and even death itself. But the notion that humankind could do so by discovering new knowledge and inventing new tools was worse than ludicrous. It was hubris. The story of the Tower of Babel, the story of Icarus, the story of Golem, and the countless other myths taught people that any attempt to go beyond human limitations would inevitably lead to disappointment and disaster. When modern culture admitted that there were many important things that it still did not know, and when that admission of ignorance was married to the idea of scientific discoveries could give us new powers, people began suspecting the real progress might be possible after all. As science began to solve one unsolvable problem after another, Many became convinced that humankind could overcome any and every problem by acquiring and applying new knowledge. Poverty, sickness, wars, famines, old age, and death itself were not the inevitable fate of humankind. They were simply the fruits of our ignorance. The famous example is lightning. Many cultures believed that lightning was the hammer of an angry god used to punish sinners. In the middle of 18th century, in one of the most celebrated experiments in scientific history, Benjamin Franklin flew a kite during a lightning storm to test the hypothesis that lightning is simply an electric current. Franklin's empirical observations, coupled with his knowledge about the qualities of electrical energy, enabled him to invent the lightning rod and disarm the gods. Poverty is another case in point. Many cultures have viewed poverty as an inescapable part of this imperfect world. According to the New Testament, shortly before the crucifixion of a woman anointed Christ with precious oil worth 300 denaries, Jesus' disciples scolded the woman for wasting such a huge sum of money instead of giving it to the poor. But Jesus defended her, saying that the poor you will always have with you, and you can help them in any time you want, but you will not always have me. Today, fewer and fewer people, including fewer and fewer Christians, agree with Jesus on this matter. Poverty is increasingly seen as a technical problem, amenable to intervention. It's common wisdom that policies based on the latest findings of agronomy, economics, medicine, and sociology can eliminate poverty. And indeed, many parts of the world have already been freed from the worst forms of deprivation. Throughout history, societies have suffered from two kinds of poverty: social poverty, which withhold from some people the opportunities available to others, and biological poverty, which puts the very lives of individuals at risk due to lack of food and shelter. Perhaps social poverty can never be eradicated, but in many countries around the world, biological poverty is a thing of the past. Until recently, most people hovered very close to the biological poverty line, below which a person lacks enough calories to sustain life for long. Even small miscalculations or misfortunes could easily push people below that line into starvation. Natural disasters and man-made calamities often plunged entire populations over the abyss, causing the death of millions. Today, most of the world's people have a safety net stretched below them. Individuals are protected from personal misfortune by insurance, state-sponsored social security, and a plethora of local and international NGOs. When calamity strikes the entire region, worldwide relief efforts are usually successful in preventing the worst. People still suffer from numerous degradations, humiliations, and poverty-related illnesses, but in most countries, nobody is starving to death. In fact, in many societies, more people are in danger of dying from obesity than from starvation. Coming to the Gilgamesh project. Of all mankind's ostensibly insoluble problems, one has remained the most vexing, interesting, and important: the problem of death itself. Before the late modern era, most religions and ideologies took it for granted that death was an inevitable fate. Moreover, most faiths turned death into the main source of meaning in life. Try to imagine Islam, Christianity, or ancient Egyptian religions in the world without death. These creeds taught people that they must come to terms with death and pin their hopes on the afterlife rather than seek to overcome death and live on earth forever. The best minds were busy giving meaning to death, not trying to escape it. That is the theme of the most ancient myth to come down to us, the Gilgamesh myth of ancient Sumer. Its hero is the strongest and the most capable man in the world, King Gilgamesh of Uruk, who could defeat anyone in battle. One day, Gilgamesh's best friend, Enkidu, died. Gilgamesh sat by the body and observed it for many days until he saw a worm dropping out of his friend's nostril. At that moment, Gilgamesh was gripped by terrible horror, and he resolved that he himself would never die. He would somehow find a way to defeat death. Gilgamesh then undertook a journey to end of the universe, killing lions, battling scorpion men, and finding his way into the underworld. There he shattered the mystery's stone, things of of Arshanabi, the ferryman of the river of the dead, and found Utnapishtim, the last survivor of pre-modern flood. Yet Gilgamesh failed in his conquest. He returned home empty-handed, as mortal as ever, but with one piece of wisdom. When the god created man, Gilgamesh has learned. They set death as man's inevitable destiny, and man must learn to live with it. Disciples of progress do not share this defeatist attitude. For men of science, death is not an inevitable destiny, but merely a technical problem. People die not because the gods decreed it, but due to the various technical failures, a heart attack, cancer, and infection, and every technical problem has a technical solution. If the heart flutters, it can be stimulated by a pacemaker or replaced by a new heart. If cancer rampages, it can be killed with drugs or radiation. If bacteria proliferates, they could be subdued with antibiotics. True, at present we cannot solve all technical problems, but we are working on them. Our best minds are not wasting their time trying to give meaning to death. Instead, they are busy investigating the physiological, hormonal, and genetic systems responsible for disease and old age. They are developing new medicines, revolutionary treatments, and artificial organs that will lengthen our lives and might one day vanquish the grim Reaper himself. Until recently, you would not have heard scientists or anyone else speak so bluntly, defeat death. What nonsense! Why are we are only trying to cure cancer, tuberculosis, and Alzheimer's disease, they insisted. People avoided the issue of death because the goal seemed too elusive. Why create unreasonable expectations? We are now at a point, however, where we can be frank about it. The leading project of scientific revolution is to give humankind eternal life, even if killing death seems a distant goal. We have already achieved things that were inconceivable a few centuries ago. In 1199, King Richard the Lionheart was struck by an arrow in his left shoulder. Today, we'd say he incurred a minor injury, but in 1199, in the absence of antibiotics and effective sterilization methods, this minor flesh wound turned infected and gangrene set in. The only way to stop the spread of gangrene in 12th century Europe was to cut off the infected limb. Impossible when the infection was in shoulder. The gangrene spread through the lion's body and no one could help the king. He died in great agony 2 weeks later. As recently as the 19th century, the best doctors still did not know how to prevent infection and stop the putrefaction of tissues. In fields, hospital doctors routinely cut off the hands and legs of soldiers who received even minor limb injuries, fearing gangrene. These amputations, as well as all other medical procedures, were done without any anesthetics. The first anesthetics, ether, chloroform, and morphine, entered regular usage in Western medicine only in the middle of 19th century. Before the advent of chloroform, 4 soldiers had to hold down the wounded comrade while the doctor shaved off the injured limb. On the morning after the Battle of Waterloo, heaps of sawn-off hands and legs could be seen adjacent to the field hospitals. In those days, carpenters and butchers who enlisted to the army were often sent to serve in medical corps because surgery required little more than knowing your way with knives and saw. In the 2 centuries since Waterloo, things have changed beyond recognition. Pills, injections, and sophisticated operations save us from this spate of illness and injuries that once dealt an inescapable death sentence. They also protect us against countless daily aches and ailments, which pre-modern people simply accepted as part of life. The average life expectancy jumped from around 25 to 40 years to around 67 in the entire world and to around 80 years in developed countries. Death suffered its worst setbacks in the arena of child mortality. Until the 20th century, between a quarter and a third of the children of agricultural societies never reached adulthood. Most succumbed to childhood diseases such as diphtheria, measles, and smallpox. In 17th century England, 150 out of 1,000 newborns died in their first year, and the third of all children were dead before they reached 15. Today, only 5 out of 1,000 English babies die during the first year, and only 7 out of 1,000 die before the age of 15. We can better grasp the full impact of these figures by setting aside statistics and telling some stories. A good example is the family of King Edward I of England and his wife, Queen Eleanor. Their children enjoyed the best conditions and most nurturing surroundings that could be provided in medieval Europe. They lived in palaces, ate as much as food as they liked, had plenty of warm clothing, well stocked fireplaces, and cleanest water available, an army of servants and best doctors. The sources mention 16 children that Queen Eleanor born between 1255 and 1284. The youngest, Edward, was the first of the boys to survive the dangerous years of childhood, and at his father's death, he ascended the English throne as King Edward II. In other words, it took Eleanor 16 tries to carry out the most fundamental mission of English queen, to provide her husband with a male heir. Edward II, mother, had been a woman of exceptional patience and fortitude. Not so the woman Edward chose for his wife, Isabella of France. She had him murdered when he was 43. To the best of our knowledge, Eleanor and Edward I were a healthy couple and passed no fatal hereditary illness on to their children. Nevertheless, 10 out of the 16, 62%, died during childhood. Only 6 managed to live beyond the age of 11, and only 3, just 18%, lived beyond the age of 40. In addition to these births, Eleanor most likely had a number of pregnancies that ended in miscarriage. On average, Edward and Eleanor lost a child every 3 years, 10 children, one after another. It's nearly impossible for a parent today to imagine such a loss. How long will the Gilgamesh project, the quest for immortality, take to complete? 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years? When we recall how little we know about the human body in 1900 and how much knowledge we have gained in a single century, there is a cause for optimism. Genetic engineers have recently managed to double the average life expectancy of Sinorhabditis elegans worms. Could they do the same for Homo sapiens? Nanotechnology experts are developing a bionic immune system composed of millions of nanorobots who could inhabit our bodies, open blocked blood vessels, fight viruses and bacteria, eliminate cancerous cells, and even reverse aging process. A few serious scholars suggest that by 2050, some humans will become not immortal because they could still die of some accident, but immortal, meaning that in the absence of fatal trauma, their lives could be extended indefinitely. Whether or not Project Gilgamesh succeeds, from an historical perspective, it is fascinating to see that most late modern religions and ideologies have already taken death and the afterlife out of the equation. Until the 18th century, religions considered death and its aftermath central to the meaning of life. Beginning in the 18th century, religions and ideologies such as liberalism, socialism, and feminism lost all interest in the afterlife. What exactly happens to the communists after he or she dies? What happens to a capitalist? What happens to a feminist? It is pointless to look for the answers in the writings of Marx, Adam Smith, or Simone de Beauvoir. The only modern ideology that still awards death a central role is nationalism. In its more poetic and desperate moments, nationalism promises that whoever dies for the nation will forever live in its collective memory. Yet this promise is so fuzzy that even most nationalists do not really know what to make out of it. The sugar daddy of science. We are living in a technical age. Many are convinced that science and technology hold the answer to all our problems. We should just let the scientists and technicians go on with their work, and they will create heaven here on earth. But science is not an enterprise that takes place on some superior moral or spiritual plane above the rest of human activity. Like other parts of our culture, it is shaped by economic, political, and religious interests. Science is a very expensive affair. A biologist seeking to understand the human immune system requires laboratories, test tubes, chemicals, electron microscopes, not to mention lab assistants, technicians, plumbers, and cleaners. The economist seeking to Model credit markets must buy computers, set up giant data banks, and develop complicated data processing programs. An archaeologist who wishes to understand the behavior of archaic hunter gatherers must travel to distant lands, excavate ancient ruins, and data fossilized bones and artifacts. All of this costs money. During the past 500 years, modern science has achieved wonders thanks largely to the willingness of governments, businesses, foundations, and private donors to channel billions of dollars into scientific research. These billions have done much more to chart the universe, map the planet, and catalogue the animal kingdom than did Galileo, Galilei, Christopher Columbus, and Charles Darwin. In these particular geniuses has never been born. Their insights would probably have occurred to others, but if the proper funding were unavailable, to intellectual brilliance could have compensated for that. If Darwin had never been born, for example, we'd today attribute the theory of evolution to Alfred Russel Wallace, who came up with the idea of evolution via natural selection independently of Darwin and just a few years later. But if the European powers had not financed geographical, zoological, and botanical research around the world, neither Darwin nor Wallace would have had the necessary empirical data to develop the theory of evolution. It is likely that they would have never even tried it. Why did the billions start flowing from government and businesses' coffers into labs and universities? In academic circles, many are naive enough to believe in pure science. They believe that governments and businesses altruistically give them money to pursue whatever research projects strike their fancy. But this hardly describes the realities of science funding. Most scientific studies are funded because somebody believes they can help attain some political, economic, or religious goal. For example, in the 16th century, king and bankers channeled enormous resources to finance geographical expeditions around the world, but not a penny for studying child psychology. This is because kings and bankers surmised that the discovery of new geographical knowledge would enable them to conquer new lands and set up trade empires, whereas they could not see any profit in understanding a child psychology. In the 1940s, the governments of America and the Soviet Union channeled enormous resources to study the nuclear physics rather than the underwater archaeology. They surmised that studying nuclear physics would enable them to develop nuclear weapons, whereas underwater archaeology was unlikely to help win wars. Scientists themselves are not always aware of the political, economic, and religious interests that control the flow of money. Many scientists do, in fact, act on a pure intellectual curiosity. However, only rarely do scientists dictate the scientific agenda. Even if we wanted to finance pure science, unaffected by political, economic, or religious interests, it would probably be impossible. Our resources are limited after all. Ask a congressman to allocate an additional million dollars to National Science Foundation for basic research, and he will justifiably ask whether that money would not be better used to fund teacher training or give needed tax break to the troubled factory in his district. To channel limited resources, we must answer questions such as what is more important and what is good. And these are not scientific questions. Science can explain what exists in the world, how things work, and what might be in the future. By definition, it has no potentials to knowing what should be in the future. Only religions and ideologies seeks to answer such questions. Consider the following quandary. Two biologists from the same department, possessing the same professional skills, have both applied for a $1 million grant to finance their current research project. Professor Slughorn wants to study a disease that infects the udders of cows, causing a 10% decrease in the milk production. Professor Sprout wants to study whether cows suffer mentally when they are separated from their calves, assuming that the amount of money is limited and that it's impossible to finance both the research projects. Which one should be funded? There is no scientific answer to this question. There are only political, economic, and religious answers. In today's world, it is obvious that Slughorn has a better chance of getting the money, not because other diseases are scientifically more interesting than bovine mentality, but because the dairy industry, which stands to benefit from the research, has more political and economic clout than the animal rights lobby. Perhaps in a strict Hindu society where cows are sacred, or in a society committed to animal rights, Professor Sprout would have a better shot. But As long as she lives in a society that values the commercial potential of milk and the health of its human citizens over the feelings of a cow, she'd best write up her research proposal so as to appeal those assumptions. For example, she might write, the depression leads to a decrease in milk production. If we understand the mental world of dairy cows, we could develop psychiatric medications that will improve their mood, thus raising milk production by up to 10%. I estimate that there is a global annual market of $250 million for bovine scientific medications. Psychiatric medications. Science is unable to set its own priorities. It is also incapable of determining what to do with its discoveries. For example, from purely scientific viewpoint, it is unclear what we should do with our increasing understanding of genetics. Should we use this knowledge to cure cancer, to create a race of genetically engineered supermen, or engineer dairy cows with supersized udders? It is obvious that the liberal government, a communist government, a Nazi government, and a capitalist business corporation would use the very scientific discovery for completely different purposes, and there is no scientific reason to prefer one usage over the other. In short, the scientific research can flourish only in alliance with some religion or ideology. The ideology justifies the cost of research. In exchange, the ideology influences the scientific agenda and determines what to do with its discoveries. Hence, in order to comprehend how humankind has reached Alamo Gordo and the moon rather than any number of alternative destinations, it is not enough to survey the achievements of physicists, biologists, and sociologists. We have to take into account the ideological, political, and economic forces that shaped physics, biology, and sociology, pushing them in certain directions while neglecting others. Two forces in particular deserve our attention: imperialism and capitalism. The feedback loop between science, empire, and capital has arguably been history's chief engine for the past 500 years. The following chapters analyze its working. First, we look at how the twin turbines of science and empire were latched to one another, and then learn how both were hitched up to the money pump of capitalism.